a story that was published rather late, around 1950, and the time in which the story takes place is actually very defined. And how do we know when the action of the story takes place? What clues do we have?
It's mentioned 1928 year. 1928.
No, it's later than that. This is
between two wars. The First World War.
Well, I think it's actually after World War II and before the War of Independence. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about somewhere between 1945 and 1947. There are heightened problems and tensions in Palestine. The British are about to leave. They've imposed a curfew so that you can't stay out past like 8 o'clock at night. And the narrator says that there have been a number of times when he has stayed over at the Greifenbach's house because he hasn't been able to get back to the suburb in which he lives. And the narrator has the feel of somebody like Agnon. He's a writer and has a family. He's friendly with these German Jews, with the Greifenbachs. So what else do we know about the period and the time it takes place here? The Greifenbachs are leaving their house to do what?
To trip.
To
trip.
Yeah, to go on. Yeah, go on an extensive trip abroad. And what are they? Especially Mrs. Greifenbach, what is she so concerned about? They're very worried.
She's not safe in her house.
About the house, whether the house is going to be safe. Mm-hmm. And why, everybody who goes away is concerned that their house is safe, but what is it about the particular historical period that makes them particularly anxious about it?
Maybe 14th years, because they've spoken about soldiers that coming from the war and they are found for the flat, for the buildings.
Yes, it's a period where there are a lot of returning soldiers, a lot of refugees, and no housing. Mm-hmm. And so a house that's empty, you could have what we call squatters who would come in. Very hard to get them out once they're in. According to British common law, if somebody's squatting in a house, it's very hard to kind of legally get them out. So this is the premise of the story. The Greifenbachs are going away. They're having a conversation with the narrator, who's a friend, and the idea comes up that he volunteers that he will occasionally sleep in the house. And why does he do that? Does he do it simply because he's their friend and wants to do them a good service? He's attracted to this house. And what's the source of the attraction?
The historian.
No.
Doctor.
Yes, Dr. Ginat, yes. Who's renting the room. Right? And in fact, it's a very funny conversation at the beginning because the Greifenbachs are so anxious about their house, that's all they think about, and then all the narrator wants to hear about is their boarder, Dr. Ginat, who's renting a room. And it's as if the narrator is only interested in hearing about that, and he doesn't pay much attention to the worries that the Greifenbachs have about the house. And so right away, the story begins with something that's unexplained. What is it about Dr. Ginat and the research that he does and the text that he's published that is so extraordinary, that everybody's talking about, and even the narrator, all he wants to hear about is Dr. Ginat. Have you seen him? What is he like? So that's the initial premise of the story. We should also mention the specific location of the Griefenbach's house in Jerusalem? What do we know about it?
Is it a little bit outside of old part of Jerusalem?
That's right.
And it's
That's for
situated on the hill? From
Well-
this hill is very
Well,
beautiful.
not a hill, it's in a valley.
Oh, a valley.
It's in a valley, a guy. And so that's important, in part because that's one of the reasons why they're worried, because there aren't a lot of neighbors around to look at the house. But it also makes the house somewhat separated from the ordinary Jerusalem. It's in a valley by itself. And all the action in the story takes place at night, takes place with a moon out, and in an atmosphere that is very separate from the earthly Jerusalem, the regular Jerusalem that we know. So right away in the story, there are really kind of two worlds. One world is the ordinary historical world. It's the era on the eve of the world liberation. The British are trying to maintain control of the city, imposing a curfew. The Griefenbachs are secular, worldly people. They're going to go on a journey. So that's the Jerusalem of historical reality. But the house itself seems to be off on its own in this moonlit valley away from everything else, and it seems to attract people to it. So the narrator wants to be there. Gamzu is wandering around, and for some reason he doesn't know why, is attracted to the house. We know why. We know because Dr. Ginat has Gamla in his room when the moon is out, but that's not evident to us. It's just that that's what is attracting. So we have a story where there's a realistic world and foundation, and a fantastic, mythic world as well. So the question is how these are related to each other. And that's what occurs within the story. There's another level, which is the fact that the narrator has written the story, that the whole story, both the realistic part and the mythic part, are the creation of the writer, who's the narrator in the story. So it's not easy in the story to understand the boundaries between reality and fiction, and whether you understand fiction as something which is art, like a great writer creates a world, or whether it's fiction in the sense of something that is invented or made up, that maybe isn't true or doesn't exist in real life, but is fabricated or made up. Now, if you remember, part of the songs that Gamula sings with her father are in a language that the two of them have invented themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's not a kind of an organic language that people speak, but something that they've invented. And they've invented it for their own amusement, for their own delight in some way. So in the story, there are a lot of levels in which things aren't real. And the question is, are they not real in the sense of artistic, something where we say that we know that art is invented, but it is for a higher purpose? Or is it a forgery? Forgery is something where you try to pass off something that looks authentic, but really isn't authentic. What is a copy? The leaves that Gamzu gives the Greifenbachs are copies of the original leaves. And we don't know about the hymns that are published, whether they're real or not. So all this question of what's real and what isn't, and it's complicated by the fact of we only know what's real in terms of who tells it to us. So in the story, one of the questions is, who is the source for the information that we have? And can we trust that source? When we spoke about the story about Tirza, we spoke about reliable narrators and unreliable narrators. Narrators you can trust and narrators you can't. And that's a serious question in this story as well. Who tells us most of the story about this ancient, archaic kingdom somewhere in the Middle East? Who is the source of that whole story? Now the narrator is very interested in hearing about it. Whom does he hear about it from? Who tells that story within the story?
Husband or
Gamsu.
What was it?
Gamsu.
Gamsu, right. Gamsu is the source of most everything we know. We see everything from his point of view. We don't know anything about Dr. Ginat. We see nothing from his point of view. We don't know what his motives are, why he's doing what he's doing. And we don't hear anything from the point of view of Gamla either. It's all narrated from Gamsu. So that's a question of who is Gamsu and what is his interest? In other words, what are his motives? What are his reasons for telling the story and for describing things the way he does? So all of this makes the story very interesting. And I want to add a larger perspective to think about in a big way, that we'll come back to it, is that many readers of the story have thought of it as something of an allegory about the sources for the construction of the culture of the new state of Israel. Remember, the story is taking place just on the eve of the War of Liberation, when Israel is about to become a state. And one of the great questions is, what kind of a state is this going to be? What is going to be the Jewish culture of the state? Is it going to be, secular Zionist? Is it going to be religious? And one of the questions is, what is this relationship going to be to the ancient culture of Israel, the Bible? And all these scenes we have here about this tribe, from the tribe of God that lives somewhere in the mountains above the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, we don't know exactly where, and its relevance to the creation of this new culture. And these were real issues at the time. There was a movement in the early years of the state of Israel called the Canaanites, or the Canaanim, which argued that the new state of Israel should see itself as completely separate from the Judaism of the diaspora. And in fact, it should connect itself not just to the Bible, but to the almost primitive Middle Eastern pagan sources of the Bible. What the Bible, the culture of the Canaanites and in Ugaritic, what was the ancient civilizations that Israelite religion was built upon. So this is an argument that the the state should not be Jewish, but it should be Israelite. It should go back to the primitive origins of the Jewish people before it was the Jewish people, and it was tribes of nomads coming into the land. And this was a radical movement within Israeli culture that was the most extreme form of anti-diaspora, anti-exile. So it went so far as viewing everything that came after this very early ancient period as a kind of injury, a kind of disfiguration, a kind of warping of what should be the true origins of the people, which should be in this kind of primitive worship with primitive gods. It wasn't so much about monotheism versus paganism, but it was about looking for that the state of Israel should be a new departure, and that the citizens of this state should be Hebrews rather than Jews, Ivriim. This was a very radical position. This was not the normative or majority position of the Zionist movement, which saw the state of Israel as a continuation. Yes, the diaspora was a kind of interlude or holding action. The Bible is more important, but it didn't go as far as the radical position of the Canaanites. So this is going to say that the story is dealing with larger cultural questions about what the new state should be. So you have a kind of contradiction, opposition. On the one hand, you have Gamzu. Gamzu is himself very traditional. He went to yeshiva, he believes in the traditional God of Israel, he goes to synagogue, and as opposed to Ginat, who is more of the critical, scholarly, modern, younger mind. Ginat, even though he doesn't have a university position himself, what he's interested in doing is what critical scholars do, which is that they try to discover ancient languages. They want to understand the grammar of those languages. They publish texts of these ancient languages. So he's published, I think, 3 books. One book is 99 words in the language of Eido. And then he publishes a grammar of the Eido language. And then he publishes the Einamite hymns. This is Eido and Einam, with probably notes and critical additions and so forth. And the approach is very scholarly. It's very part of a kind of Wissenschaft approach, that is a kind of science of the study of culture and of religions. And here, this isn't Judaism, but a study of its ancient sources. And here, Agnon is dealing with what for him was a very problematic phenomenon, which is the critical study of Judaism. He was not a big believer in it. And he thought that kind of German scientific approach to the study of Judaism was all well and good in the sense that it gave us new texts, discovered things, but that it, in a sense, squeezed out the spirit inside, that by studying things only to kind of map them and to chart them and to understand them scientifically, that you lose the inspiration you lose the spirit that's beneath the text. And this was the great movement in the 19th century, began in Germany, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, the scientific study of Judentums, of Judaism. Figures like I'm blanking on the names, Zacharias Frankel and Geiger and others, who applied the methods of German scholarship to the study of the sources of Judaism. And it's a big controversy as to whether this movement contributes to a living Judaism or whether it freezes and contains it, like puts it in a laboratory, in a kind of a test tube, rather than, let's say, bringing out the living inspiration in these religious texts. So you see something of that in this story. Ginat is of the study of it. He's a modern, all we know about Ginat, which is very little, that he's a modern scholar who's attracted to the ancient world. But what he does is to transcribe, to copy, and to publish for modern secular people those ancient texts. And it's very interesting at the climax at the end of the story, where he has Gemula there, and she is about to sing the song of the Grofit, and Gamzu rushes in. Gamzu wants her as a wife, even though apparently they have not had sex together. She remains a virgin. And Ginat, and she wants to be taken care of by Ginat, who she first met as the Jerusalem in disguise. And Ginat says, go to your husband. He's not interested in her as a relationship. He's interested only in her as what we call an informant. She's a source for this ancient poetry, but he doesn't want a real, blood relationship to her, whereas that's what Gamzu wants. So again, the story is dealing with the enormous interest in the modern world among secular enlightened people in the ancient. So at the beginning of the story, we hear when the narrator is sitting with Griefenbachs, and all he wants to know is get information about Ginat. What is he like? Why is he so interested? Because Ginat has published these 3 books, and they're bestsellers. Now, there's in the world of people who are interested in this kind of thing, it's a sensation. It's a big deal. It's as if he's discovered something that nobody knew, and everybody's interested in it. So this is one of the questions. Why should modern secular people, or even people who are religious in a modern way, be so interested in the ancient or archaic world? So are they interested in it as just intellectual curiosity? There are some people who are interested in it from money. They're collectors. And this is what Gamzu does, is he travels around the world and he collects these texts for patrons and antiquariat, ancient booksellers who will be able to sell the books. There's a market for the ancient. And so that's one of the questions of, in the modern world, what is this fascination with the ancient or the archaic? So there are many things that are going on here. And it raises a lot of questions about what is the role of the ancient in the formation of modern culture. So let's say if in the 20th century, there's a fascination with ancient Egypt, with discovering the tombs and the pyramids, and you know, British explorers bring back all of this to the British Museum, or if you go to New York and you go to the Metropolitan Museum, the Great Museum, you'll see one of the temples that's been reconstructed there. Now, are people really interested in ancient Egypt because they see it as relevant to their lives? Are there parts of ancient Egyptian culture that they want to incorporate in their lives? Is it the fascination with the world of the dead or animals? It's an interesting question. Why in the 20th and 21st century is Western culture so fascinated by ancient cultures? You know, it's I think a question that doesn't have an easy answer, but I think part of it is that the more that modern man undergoes a process of being cultured and assimilated, I mean not assimilated, but civilized, the more there's the awareness that there's something lost, and that thing that is lost has its source, the kind of the source in these ancient civilizations. So it's a relationship of fascination. Is that term? When I say fascination, you know what I mean? Maybe somebody wants to translate it into Russian. Fascination. I mean. Okay. So I just want to mention, because this I think is a key notion here. Just the way the narrator in the story, who tells the story, who's the Agnon-like figure, is fascinated. Do we know that, does he really believe all of this, or does he not? It's unclear. And I think that's the story has a duality. It's kind of a two-faced story where in the end you can never resolve whether the real historical world of the 1940s versus this world of the moon and of the mountains somewhere in in Iraq, which is real. They both exist in the story. Okay, let's begin a little bit with what we know about Gamsu. What is he like as a figure in the way he comes across to the narrator? What kind of he's a strange person.
He's strange and he has two different eyes. One is damaged.
Right. Yes,
and one is...
right, one artificial that's dead and one is alive. Mm-hmm. And the dead one seems to be angry part of the time also. That two-ness, that duality is also important here. That he's somebody who is... it's not good and evil, but it operates on different levels. What else can you say about him?
That he's very concentrated on his wife, Gemula. All his maybe not all, but he's very deeply connected with Gemula.
He's very, very worried about her.
Worried.
He's very anxious about her. And why is he anxious? He has reason to be anxious. What's the problem?
She's ill.
Yeah.
She's unusual.
I would say she's unusual, that's for sure. But we'll get to the different parts of it, but she's ill.
She's ill.
In other words, and she seems to be incurable. In other words, there's nothing to be done for her. And what does the narrator advise Gamsu about how to deal with it? What is the advice that he gives?
Put her
put her into some kind of institution or facility for the chronically ill, because Gamzu can't care for her. He spends all day taking care of her, and then it's only at night that he can go out. So she's bedridden, and this is one of the great features of the story, that when she is in her hometown in the mountains, she is this great prophetess figure and so forth. But when he takes her from there and brings her to Jerusalem, marries her, not only is she sick, but what else happens to her?
She's under influence of moon.
Well, yes, we'll get to that. That's the only time when she seems to not be limited to her bed. But what else happens to her?
She stopped singing.
She stops singing, right? And she loses her connection to the language of Eido and Einam. So she falls silent. This also is a very important feature, because again, we're talking about in larger, more allegorical terms of what happens when you take that primitive, almost magical forces and try to bring them home, try to domesticate them. The word domesticate is to make into something that is at home. So she is like a great force, but when she's brought by Gamzu back to Jerusalem, she's sick and she's silent, and the connection to that great force is lost. Right? And she only comes alive when there's the full moon, when she becomes a somnambulist. Now, if you know that term, somnambulist is a moonwalker or a sleepwalker during the time of the moon. And the only thing that can control her are these special leaves that were given to Gamzu by her father. So Gamzu is very worried about her, and again, it's on two levels. It's as if they're discussing her like she was an ordinary sick person. Well, you should put her in a home, or you should try putting taking a garment and soaking it in cold water, putting it by her bed, as if these were normal. She was a normal sick person, and these are normal techniques for taking care of her. So again, that belongs to the more realistic level of the story. It's as if somebody, unfortunately, has a chronically ill wife, and Gamzu and the narrator are talking about practical measures to take to alleviate her situation. What I was trying to get from you before is the other feature of Gamzu is the fact that he's a great storyteller. He is the one who just pours out the story about his life and the story about how he met Gamula to the narrator. And it's also very interesting the conditions under which he tells these stories. When does he come to tell the narrator? What time of day is it?
It's nighttime.
It's nighttime. And what situation is the narrator in?
He's not on his home.
He's not in his home, yes, that's for sure. And one of the reasons he's attracted to spending occasionally some nights in the Griffenbachs is what does he feel there? This has to do with peace and sleeping and tranquility. So what is he attracted to?
He wants to
Some noises around.
Well, there aren't noises. In other words, because this is away from the city, it's in a valley by itself.
What strange noises.
Well, he feels as if he is going to get the greatest sleep of his life there. He doesn't even have to read. He's getting ready for a wonderful, tranquil repose, right? It's kind of like a natural, you know, it's like you go away from the city and you go to on a retreat or to a spa and get away from television and from your phone, and you know, it gets dark out and he is going to let himself be carried away into slumber. It's exactly at that moment that Gamzu shows up and begins telling his story. So the story is a kind of interruption or an intervention in the narrator's desire to be mindless, to be thoughtless, to drift off into sleep. So Gamzu comes and he interrupts that. And also part of the mystery is, how does Gamzu know that the narrator is in Griffenbach's house? Well, he doesn't know. This is a fact that is not known to anybody. But he's attracted to it. He's out wandering, trying to find his wife, who has left through a window and is walking on the roofs of the houses of Jerusalem. And he, in his wanderings, is somehow attracted to the Griffenbach's house. Now, you know, we as readers know that it has something to do with Dr. Ginat. He doesn't know that Ginat is there, and that Ginat has this connection to his wife, but he feels it. And the narrator also is attracted to the house as well. So there are kind of mystical attractions that are going on here. Okay. One of the things that I found funny is that Gamzu comes, it's late at night, narrator wants to go to sleep. Not so late, but it's dark. And Gamzu begins telling a very long story. And what I found funny about it is that he's supposedly very anxious about finding his wife, but instead of going out and finding her, he settles into this long story that he tells. So the story becomes a kind of substitute for the actual search for his wife or connection to his wife. So Gamzu is a storyteller. So within the story that Agnon is telling of Eido of Einam, which is told by the narrator, inside of that is the story that Gamzu tells about his own life and how he came to these mountains to find Gamula. So it's interesting, a large part of the story is what he tells us, and to repeat what I said before, the only source of knowledge we have about Gamula and Ginat is through Gamzu. Okay, there's no other way in which we have of knowing about them. So it's all through this man. So what do we know about the biography of Gamzu? What does he tell the narrator? What were his origins as a young man, as a boy, and what kind of a background does he come from? Well, he was, a very traditional Orthodox young man who went to study in the yeshiva, and he was very poor, and he, just had a few possessions, and he was, the way in which yeshiva boys lived is that, a different day he would be given dinner by a different family. And when he finished his studies, he discovered that he had an attraction to what became his his profession, his vocation.
Books.
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 Text.
Ancient texts, so that he had the skill to understand these texts, and he also had he had no family, he had no possessions, and it was easy for him to travel to very distant and exotic places to try to find these books. Now, who was sending him? He didn't do this on his own, but it was these book collectors. In other words, in Germany, there were, an antiquariate, I think they're called, of, kind of collectors of ancient books. Again, it's part of the market. So they send him to find them in remote Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean. He brings them back, and then his employers sell them to business people, interested people, for money. So it's a market. But for him, it's not simply a job, but he's very attracted. Now, where is he going to, and where is he finding these books? What are these Jewish communities? What do you think about when you think about where he's going to?
He's going to far away from to different maybe villages or settlements which are even on the border of so far. He's going to the deserts, to the mountains.
He has to travel, through the deserts. He goes on caravans, and we're not told exactly where. I mean, it seems that where Gamula and her father are, somewhere way in the hills of northern Iraq. We'll talk about that in a moment. But he's probably traveled already also to the villages in the Atlas Mountains in North Africa. Any place where there are ancient Jewish communities, villages that no longer are connected to civilization, and there are likely to be books or manuscripts that have been preserved and that perhaps nobody's interested in anymore. And for a few dollars or pennies or marks, he can buy them and bring them back, and they will be of interest to scholars. Now, it's important to point out that for him, again, it's not just a job, but one of the things that he has discovered, that he's famous for, is finding ancient poetry. By ancient, I mean by sacred poets. There's the word for sacred poetry in Hebrew is piyut. It's a very ancient word. We don't quite know what the source of the word piyut is. It may be from the Greek. We're not sure. But already from the time of the rabbis, in the 3rd, 4th century, especially in Palestine, there is an enormous creation of sacred poems, and those poems are poems that are created to enhance and add to the synagogue service, so that all the major prayers in the synagogue service, especially for holidays and for special Sabbaths, will have sacred poems written in Hebrew, very, very difficult in Hebrew, using the language of the Bible and the language of the Midrashim, that were used by Jewish communities in the Near East, beginning in the 5th, 6th, 7th century, throughout the early and mid-Middle Ages, and in North Africa through the 19th century of great religious poetry. There was secular poetry in Spain in the Middle Ages, but that was a kind of exception. But from the 4th or 5th century on, we have these wonderful poems. They're hard to read today, they're very complicated. If you're in the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, the prayer book, the Machzor that's used in those days, has a selection of those piyutim. They're difficult for modern readers because the Hebrew is very, very high, very erudite, very complicated. But some of the piyutim are very much loved by congregations because they're sung to tunes, and they're what make the high holy days, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, services long and full of songs, because if it were just be the regular liturgy, Yom Kippur would be like 2 hours, but when you add all of the supplementary sacred poetry, it becomes a day-long event. The most powerful of this poetry was created in Palestine in the 5th, 6th, and 7th century by poets with the name of Yossi ben Yossi, and the Kalir is the greatest one, and it goes on forever. There are literally many tens of thousands of these piyutim, and many of them we only know now through discovering ancient manuscripts. I think you've all heard about the Cairo Geniza. And one of, the Geniza has many things in it. People study it for all sorts of, to understand social history, to understand family relations. But it's studied also because it has the bits and pieces of the prayer books that were used in the communities of that region, before the year 1000. And it has the piyutim, the sacred poems, from different communities. Different communities kept the popularity of certain sacred poets. And so they don't have the same status as the prayers themselves, so they can change. And so if you go to today, if you go on Rosh Hashanah, let's say, in Jerusalem, to Jews from Tripoli, from North Africa, or Jews from Rome, or from Kurdistan, or from Bulgaria, or from Germany, you will find different piyutim, different rites, R-I-T-E, or Hebrew nuschaot. And the difference is essentially the different sacred poems. So this is to say that what we today know of these poems is only a very small, really the tip of the iceberg of all of the poems and activities that once existed. So what Gamzu is doing is he's going to these remote communities and looking at the poems that were preserved by those particular communities that never got passed down to the 20th century. And so he's fascinated by it. For him, as a religious person, it's as if he is gaining access to a whole treasury of new great poems. Now, if you remember his biography, the turning point for him, from being a student of the Talmud to being a student of, fascinated by piyutim, he was given the divan of Yehuda Halevi. Yehuda Halevi was one of the great poets in Spain. It's both secular poetry and sacred poetry, and perhaps the most famous one. At the end of his life, he traveled from from Spain toward Egypt and to the land of Israel and died there in a pilgrimage. And he wrote the great poem of Tzion Halo Tishali, Zion. It's an ode to Zion that became the basis for the song after the Six-Day War, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. That's that song. He's the most famous of the religious poets. Somebody gave Gamzu the collection, the divan of Yehuda Halevi, and that was the turning point for him. He discovered these poems, and then for him, going and searching for them throughout the world became his passion. And it was also a livelihood too. He was able to live from it, but it was more of a mission of discovering this. And so this is something that he has in common with Ginat, right? They're both interested in these great ancient poems. They're both connected to them, but their connection is different. For Gamzu, it's a source of religious inspiration and meaning. For Ginat, we don't know, but his relationship is that of a critical scholar. He wants to document them and present them, and he looks at it over a distance. He looks at it from the point of view of a post-Enlightenment scientific scholar who is trying to understand the ancient mind. Very different from Gamzu, for whom it's all part of a kind of religious experience. And the way in which Gamzu tells his stories is a way in which it meshes legend with fact. So he begins to tell the story of how did this community in the mountains get there. And so where did they come from? They're Jews, but where did they, from what point in Jewish history did they come to this remote area? Where did they come from? If the Israelites lived in the land of Israel, how did these people get to be in these remote mountains somewhere in northern Mesopotamia?
Are they connected with Dan tribes? Something?
With?
Dan tribes of Dan?
No, tribe of Gad.
God.
Gad. Okay, it has to begin with a G. I don't know if that came through in the Russian translation, because H and G I know is complicated in Russian. But what's true of all the names in the story? They all begin with G. Greifenbach, Gamzu, and Ginat, everything. And your father, everything is a G, or an Einam. So you should ask me the question, why is that? So you have to remember to ask me before our time is up as to what's the secret? Why do all the names begin with G? So it has to do with the destruction of the temple in the year 70 AD. Well, actually before that, and there are two destructions. The exile of Jews to Babylonia. This is the Babylonian exile. And 50 years after the Babylonian exile, with the rise of Cyrus, he allowed the Jews to go back to Palestine. So if you know your Bible, you know that this is what's called the Restoration, or the Shivat Zion period. These are the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So, but the fact is that many Jews were exiled to Babylonia, but only a small amount returned to the land of Israel. They had a very difficult time reestablishing a sacred center in Jerusalem. But many Jews stayed in Babylonia, right? This is how the Babylonian exile began. And over the course of many centuries, there was a very strong Jewish community in Babylonia, and that is where the Talmud comes from. It's called the Babylonian Talmud for a reason, because the Babylonian Jewish community during that time was much stronger than the one in the land of Israel. So the story that Gamzu tells is that the inhabitants of this village come from the 10 tribes who were exiled even before the destruction of the first temple. Before the temple is destroyed, the 10 tribes are destroyed by the Assyrians, 720, I think, before the Common Era, and in other words, about 150 years before 580 or 520, the destruction of the temple. And so Gamzu says that these are among the original 10 tribes. So there were 12 tribes, right, according to the 12 children of Jacob. And which are the 2 tribes that remain? Judah and Benjamin. Okay, that's the southern kingdom, right? It was the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is destroyed. That's Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the others, except for Judah and Benjamin in the south. And 150 years later, it's that southern kingdom that's destroyed. And the Jewish people, as we know it, come from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And so one of the great mysteries throughout the Jewish imagination is what happened to the other 10 tribes. And throughout, the centuries, there are people claiming to do, the Amazonian Indians, the American Indians, that these are the 10 tribes. All sorts of theories about the 10 tribes. And so in Gamzu's narrative, one of the tribes, the tribe of Gad, and it's important that it begins with a G, right, with a G, the Gad, is exiled. It goes further, and then they create a life. They are threatened by their enemies, and most of them are destroyed, and then they go far up into the mountains where they can be safe. And because they're far up in the mountains, they no longer have a connection to the rest of the Jewish people. So they're living their own life, and they preserve the traditions of prayer and the rituals as they knew them, but it's all from before the time of the Talmud and the rabbis. They don't know about that. They only know about a kind of biblical religion, but they're very faithful to it. Okay? And they live their lives there, and there's a kind of myth of origins that Gamzu describes, that the young men are forced by the Assyrians to bring these big stones around their neck, millstones, to punish them. And they carry these millstones into the diaspora, and they use the millstones to create the foundation for their synagogue and for their homes. So again, in Gamzu's telling, we don't know what is legend and what is truth. For him, there aren't boundaries. So the idea that these young men could carry the millstones and then into the mountains and use them as the foundation of their synagogues is a story. But for him, it's all of one piece. Now, what happens to these remnants of the tribe of God in the mountains? Are they happy? Do they prosper? Well, not so much. When he finds them, they are in fact very sickly and depressed because the exile has gone on for so long. So it's not as if they're having such a great time, and they're languishing, they're declining. And it's only Gamula's father, who is this larger-than-life warrior, holy man figure, who has preserved the great traditions. He is the one who knows all of the songs and all of the poetry. He's a figure of great wisdom, a kind of Moses-like figure. But he is not productive or generative. He has only one child, this daughter. His wife died in childbirth. He does not remarry. And what does he do with all of the wisdom that he has? Is he going to die with him? He tries to teach Gemula. In other words, his daughter is going to be the recipient of his wisdom. He transfers that to her. And she is in herself, a charismatic figure. When Gamzu sees her, he sees her first at the time of the full moon on the top of the ledge of a mountain, declaiming this poetry. And how does he perceive her? Again, this is through his mind, his framework of values. What is she to him? What does he make of her? Anybody remember? He views her as if she is the Shekhinah. Now this is an interesting and important term, in rabbinic Judaism. The Shekhinah is the feminine, empathic, feeling part of God, according to the thought of the rabbis, that when the destruction of the temple took place, the Shekhinah went into exile with the Jews as a kind of empathy for them. So we speak in theology about transcendence and immanence. These are two important terms. Transcendent God is the God you can't see, that is beyond anything, transcends, versus the immanent dimension of God. Immanent is what is close, what is dwelling close to you. You can think of like immanent. And so in rabbinic theology, there are two dimensions to God. The God beyond everything, the transcendent, and the part that's closer to humanity, which is the Shekhinah. It's still God, but okay. And the Shekhinah becomes a kind of almost mythical figure. So in Gamzu's eyes, the eyes of this traditional Jew who is trying to connect with the great sources of the people, he experiences her as if she is a kind of Shekhinah, kind of a prophetess of some sort. And he falls in love with her. And he finds a way to get her father to agree to let him marry her. And he pushes aside the other warrior, whose name I can't remember, but it begins with a G, as all the names do, right? And he takes her. Now, and it's as if he has seen something that is powerful and beautiful and primitive, and he wants to take it, and to take it back with him to Jerusalem. Now, this isn't the whole story, because he is not the only Westerner to have come to these hills. And who else comes? Who else is visited? Dr. Ginat, but they don't know him as Dr. Ginat because he's come disguised as a Jerusalem Chacham, as a Jerusalem wise man. And he comes there and he disguises himself because he wants to, make himself acceptable and not too foreign. And he wants to disguise his real purpose. His real purpose is to do research, is to collect and write down these extraordinary poems in this language that is not known to other people. And he he disguises himself. It's a kind of fiction for the purpose of science to do this. Is it nice? Is it fair? That's not the issue that's dealt with. But Gamla, Gamula is attracted to him as well, but he disappears and leaves. But she doesn't know that he is really who he is, Dr. Ginat. So Gamsu brings her back. There's a sense in which this community of the descendants of God really can't exist very much longer. The father dies, the wisdom is transferred to Gamula, and he brings her back to Jerusalem. But the great and sad irony is that that wisdom can't transfer from its own original context into the 20th century and into this modern world of Jerusalem. She becomes sick and she falls silent, and so except for these full moons, the great power that she once had is destroyed and erased. And all Gamsu has is an invalid, a sickly wife to take care of. And he hasn't been able to be with her as a husband would be with a wife. This becomes clear in the climax scene when Ginat says to Gamula, "Go to your husband," and she says to him, "He has never seen me naked. You know, he has never had marital relations with me. I'm still a virgin. I'm still yours if you want me." So, what happens in that climax scene? Gamula has been sleepwalking, and Dr. Ginat is taking advantage of the fact that only when the moon is out and she's sleepwalking does she connect again to the poetry, and he is writing it down. And then he's discovered by Gamsu, who's been attracted to the Greifenbach's home. He forces himself in, and in that scene, he wants to take Gamula back. Dr. Ginat does not want to take Gamula. He's not her husband, and he doesn't want to be. And Gamula, poor Gamula, is stuck in the middle. She's walking on the roof, and she does not regard herself as a possession of Gamsu. She is in love with Ginat. Ginat is an imposter. He is not who she thinks he is. He is not the Jerusalem Chacham, wise man who has come. And something happens, and she falls off of the roof. Ginat tries to save her. We don't know what happens, and they both die. Okay. Now, what happens at the end? In other words, within the more symbolic or allegorical picture of this, why do you think there's the death of the two of them at the end? And one of the questions is, if you're looking at the story from the point of view of realism, then you can explain it that in naturalistic terms, they lost their balance. She was sleepwalking and tripped and slipped, and he was trying to save her, and they fell over and died. Within the more symbolic or non-realistic code of the story, it's a story about a figure like Gamula who can only exist when she can be connected to the sources of poetry and can sing, and she can no longer do that. And Ginat as well is somebody who is not known to the world. He's not a professor someplace. Nobody knows about him. He exists only as a scholar who has transcribe the language of Eido and Einam and the hymns and so forth. So he exists only to the degree to which he can transcribe her words and her poetry. She can no longer exist. So it's as if he is a kind of artist and she's a kind of artist, and their death is a kind of romantic death. It's a death of two people who can no longer be creative. That creativity is died, so they have to die with it. They're different, Ginat and Gamula. She is the source, he is the vehicle for it, and so that life can no longer exist. Again, we're left in the story always with two different modes, two different keys of understanding. One the realistic, and the other the more mystical or magical or symbolic. Now, what's interesting is that the narrator who's telling the story is interested in both. He's clearly somebody who's an ordinary person. And I meant to point out, in fact, that what is similar between the beginning, this story, and the story A Whole Loaf, in terms of the situation of the narrator? What is common between the two stories? What situation is the narrator in at the beginning of the story, A Whole Loaf? Where he is...
They are both alone.
They're alone
for this moment.
Because
the family is abroad.
Right. So the narrator is somebody who is a married man, but his family is away. You know, in A Whole Loaf, it seems to be because they're abroad, outside of Palestine, and he hasn't bothered to kind of bring them back. In this story, they're vacationing on the coast in Gedera. It has to be with a G again. And he's left to his own devices. This is very common in these stories. So he's a man who is not, at this moment, not grounded in the realism of having a wife and a family, and having taken care of his children, and living in his own home. He leaves his home. He is adrift, and so he can spend time in this special house, which is in the moonlight, in the valley, away from everything else, and which has this warder or tenant, Dr. Ginat, who's connected to something very special. That's the connection. So the narrator is somebody who is very down to earth, but is also very fascinated by Gamzu's story. And he is not in a hurry to say to us as readers, you know, you have to accept either the realistic plane or the mystical plane. The two can exist together. So he allows us to feel the attraction, the fascination for this archaic religious world that Gamula represents. We don't have to really make a choice about whether everything Gamzu relates is true, or the fact that we see everything through his eyes makes him unreliable. But there's a tragic ending, but the narrator is a figure who is available. He's susceptible. He leaves his home. He is spending the night in this special place, and he allows Gamzu to tell his story, and for that story to populate and become really the basis of the story that Agnon has told us. So, just to conclude, this is a story in which Agnon is, in a sense, playing with the fascination with ancient things. he's playing with the idea of what is going to be the source for the culture of the new state of Israel and for Zionism. Is it going to be Judaism as a continuous civilization? Or is this new state going to try to go back to the origins of the Bible? And also, what are the possibilities of myth-making, of storytelling, where the boundaries are between the fictional imagination and forgery and telling a lie. We know that fiction is a lie. This is, commonplace. But we think that fiction is good when it's a good lie. In other words, that it's a lie that for a purpose or that creates a world and so forth. Within the world of the story, we have instances of misrepresentation, forgery. Ginat disguises himself as somebody who he is not and presents it that way. And we have also, very interestingly, between Gemula and her father, they invent a language. So what languages are spoken in this place? They speak the local language, they speak Eido, and then this language that's invented that only exists between Gemula and her father as well. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? So there are different degrees of invention, and that also is, we'll end with this, is the notion of creating a nation. In other words, in the 19th century, with the rise of nationalism, the idea of creating Germany or creating France or Italy out of many different small territories or principalities was also a question of inventing something. These are what a famous scholar, Benedict Anderson, has called invented communities, imaginary communities. In the same way, Zionism is the invention of a state of the Jews that's made up of all sorts of pieces of the Jewish past. It's not inevitable or organic, but it's something that was created. It's an invention, and its culture is invented as well. And the story dramatizes some of the key issues that are involved in the invention of this new community. Okay, yes, please.
We're trying to remind you about why all the names
I
start
see.
together.
I see. Okay. Well, let me answer this by saying Agnon's name in Hebrew is Agnon, and we said that he took his name from the idea of the Aguna, of the wife who can't marry and so forth. Okay. Now, all of the names in the story are taken from Gimel and Ayin here. There's another story called Adolam, which are all Ayins. This is the Gimel here. This is the G sound of the Gimel, or kind of like that in printed Hebrew. So there's something very playful about it, and the playfulness seems to have something to do with Agnon's own grandiosity, or his own self-love, I would say. So these letters have something to do with his own name. And his own name is an invention. We said it was Chachka's, and he made it into Agnon. So we have a story here where all the proper names begin with one letter, and that letter is a letter taken from Agnon's name. So it's saying something about, again, the fact that this is created by an author who wants his initials to remain very prominent. So it's a connection, I think, to him and to his name as well. This is an interpretation. In other words, there's no official explanation for it, and one could wonder why. There's something clearly playful about it. You know, this doesn't occur in real life where everything begins with one letter, and why this letter? And so this is, I think, one way of looking at it. Okay, so for tomorrow we have our final session. We're reading a comic story called, in Hebrew, Mazal Dagim. It's the zodiac sign for Pisces, for fish. That's the title of the story. It takes place in Buchach at a certain time in the 19th century. And I think you'll have a great deal of fun with it. See you tomorrow. Thank you.